Discover why this innocent portrait shocked experts with a secret no one could have imagined. Dr. Marcus Thompson adjusted his reading glasses as he sorted through another box of donated photographs at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. As a historian specializing in Reconstruction-era documentation, he'd spent the past 3 months cataloging materials from estate sales across the former Confederacy. This particular collection had come from the liquidation of the Whitmore family estate in Natchez, Mississippi. Dozens of photographs, land deeds, and personal papers spanning from the 1870s through the early 1900s. Most showed typical scenes of wealthy white families, formal portraits, plantation houses, and carefully staged family gatherings. Marcus pulled out a formal studio portrait dated 1889. The photograph showed a well-dressed white family of 4, a stern-looking man in his 40s, a woman in an elaborate dress, and 2 teenage boys in suits. But it was the 5th figure that caught Marcus's attention. Standing slightly apart from the family, positioned near the edge of the frame, was a young black girl who appeared to be around 10 years old. She wore a fine dress, not servant's clothing, but quality fabric with lace trim, and her hair was neatly styled. Her posture was rigid, and her expression was difficult to read, not quite smiling, not quite afraid, but holding something carefully controlled behind her eyes. What struck Marcus immediately was the composition. The girl wasn't positioned like a servant holding a baby or standing in the background. She was included in the family portrait itself, yet distinctly separated. Close enough to be part of the image, far enough to indicate she didn't belong to the family unit. Marcus scanned the photograph into his computer and began his standard examination process. He zoomed in on the faces first. The white family members stared at the camera with the confident expressions of people accustomed to authority and wealth. But the girl's eyes held something different, a wariness that seemed unusual for a child her age. He examined her clothing more closely. The dress was expensive, possibly as costly as what the white woman in the photograph wore. The fabric appeared to be silk or fine cotton with detailed embroidery at the collar and cuffs. This was not clothing typically provided to servants, even favored house servants. Marcus turned the photograph over. On the back, in elegant script, someone had written, "The Whitmore family with Sarah, Natchez Studio, April 1889. Just Sarah. No last name, no relationship indicated, no explanation for why a black child was included in a wealthy white family's formal portrait." Marcus had seen similar photographs before. Images of black children in white households, usually identified as servants or the children of servants, but something about this image felt different. The expensive clothing, the formal inclusion in the portrait, the careful positioning, it suggested a relationship more complex than simple domestic service. He pulled up the census records for Natchez, Mississippi, searching for the Whitmore family in 1890. He found them quickly. Robert Whitmore, age 43, listed as a cotton merchant and landowner. His wife Margaret, age 38. 2 sons, James and Thomas, ages 16 and 14, and listed in their household. Sarah, Negro female, age 10, servant. Marcus frowned. If Sarah was just a servant, why was she dressed in expensive clothing and included in a formal family portrait? Servants were occasionally photographed with families, but usually in work clothes and clearly positioned as staff, not dressed as elaborately as the family members themselves. He decided to dig deeper into the Whitmore family history, searching through property records, tax documents, and legal filings. What he discovered in the first hour of research made him sit back in his chair, his pulse quickening. Robert Whitmore's property holdings in 1889 included 200 acres of prime cotton-growing land in Adams County, Mississippi. But the land acquisition records showed something unusual. The property had been transferred to Whitmore in 1879 from the estate of someone named Joshua Carter, a black landowner. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he searched for more information about Joshua Carter. This was potentially significant. Black landowners in Mississippi in the 1870s and 1880s were rare, and their stories were often tragic. Families who had managed to acquire property during Reconstruction only to lose it through violence, fraud, or legal manipulation during the rise of Jim Crow. He found Joshua Carter in the 1870 census, a freedman, age 35, listed as a farmer who owned his land outright. The property value was listed as $4,000, a substantial sum for that era, indicating valuable agricultural land. But in the 1880 census, Joshua Carter was gone. His wife was listed as a widow, and there was a notation that the family had relocated north in 1879. Marcus felt the familiar sensation he always experienced when he was on the verge of uncovering a hidden story. Something had happened to Joshua Carter's family between 1870 and 1880. The land had ended up in Robert Whitmore's possession. And now in 1889, a black girl named Sarah was living in Whitmore's household, dressed in expensive clothing and included in family portraits. He needed to find out who Sarah really was and what had happened to connect her to the Whitmore family and to Joshua Carter's lost land. Marcus spent the next 2 days immersed in property records, wills, and legal documents from Adams County, Mississippi. The story that emerged was both complex and deeply troubling. Joshua Carter had been born into slavery around 1835 on a plantation in Adams County. After emancipation in 1865, he had worked as a sharecropper for several years, saving every penny he could. In 1868, during the brief period when Reconstruction policies supported black land ownership, Joshua had purchased 200 acres of land from a white farmer who was selling off property to pay debts. Marcus found the original deed, recorded in the Adams County Courthouse in August 1868. The purchase price was $800, paid in full in cash. Joshua Carter's signature appeared at the bottom, a careful practice script that suggested he had taught himself to write after gaining his freedom. Over the next decade, Joshua had prospered. Census records and tax documents showed that he grew cotton successfully, paid his taxes on time, and even expanded his property slightly, purchasing an adjacent 20-acre plot in 1874. By 1875, he had married a woman named Ruth, and they had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. But then the records became more complicated and sinister. In 1876, Mississippi adopted a new state constitution that effectively disenfranchised black voters and began the systematic rollback of Reconstruction gains. Violence against black landowners increased dramatically. White supremacist groups, including the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations, targeted successful black farmers using intimidation, arson, and murder to force them off their land. Marcus found a newspaper article from the Natchez Democrat, dated September 1878. Negro farmer Joshua Carter accused of debt fraud. The article claimed that Carter had obtained loans from local white merchants under false pretenses and was being sued for repayment. Marcus's stomach tightened. He recognized this pattern. During the 1870s and 1880s, false debt claims were a common tactic used to strip black families of their property. White merchants or landowners would claim that black farmers owed them money, often fabricating debts entirely or inflating real debts through fraudulent accounting. When black farmers couldn't pay, their land would be seized and sold, usually to the same white men who had filed the claims. He searched for court records related to the case. What he found was a legal proceeding from November 1878, Carter v. Whitmore and Associates. Robert Whitmore and 2 other white merchants claimed that Joshua Carter owed them a combined total of $2,200, far more than Carter's land was worth. The court records showed that Carter had contested the claims, arguing that the debts were fabricated and that he had receipts proving he'd paid for all goods purchased. But the case was heard by an all-white jury in a courthouse where black testimony was routinely dismissed or disregarded. The verdict, issued in January 1879, ruled in favor of Whitmore and his associates. Joshua Carter was ordered to pay $2,200 plus court costs and interest, or surrender his property to satisfy the debt. Marcus found the property transfer document dated March 1879. Joshua Carter's 200 acres were seized and sold at auction. Robert Whitmore purchased the land for $400, half of what Carter had originally paid for it, and far below its actual market value. But what happened to Joshua Carter and his family? Marcus searched through death records, newspaper obituaries, and church burial records. He found nothing indicating that Joshua had died in Adams County. The 1880 census listed Ruth Carter, now a widow, living in Chicago with her 3 children. There was no record of Joshua anywhere. Marcus suspected what had happened, though he might never find definitive proof. Joshua Carter had likely been killed, murdered either during the legal battle over his land or shortly after, to prevent him from challenging the theft or seeking justice. His widow and children had fled north, leaving behind everything they'd built. But the census Marcus had seen earlier listed Ruth Carter with 3 children in Chicago. The photograph from 1889 showed a girl named Sarah living with the Whitmore family in Natchez. Marcus pulled up the 1880 census record for Ruth Carter's household in Chicago again, this time examining it more carefully. Listed were Ruth, age 42, and 3 children, Rebecca, age 14, Joshua Jr., age 12, and Samuel, age 8. No Sarah. But the 1870 census for Joshua Carter's household in Mississippi showed 4 children, Rebecca, Joshua Jr., Samuel, and Sarah, who would have been only 1 year old at the time. Marcus felt a chill run through him. Sarah hadn't gone north with her mother and siblings. She had been left behind in Mississippi, living with the family that had stolen her father's land. Why? And under what circumstances? Marcus knew he needed more information about Sarah and why she had been separated from her family. He reached out to Dr. Lorraine Mitchell, a colleague at Howard University who specialized in post-Reconstruction black family histories. "I'm sending you documents about a case from Adams County, Mississippi," Marcus explained over the phone. "A black landowner named Joshua Carter had his property stolen through fraudulent debt claims in 1879. His wife and 3 children fled to Chicago, but one daughter, Sarah, appears to have stayed behind and ended up living with the white family that stole their land." "How old was Sarah when this happened?" Lorraine asked. "About 10 years old based on the census records. The same age she appears to be in a photograph from 1889. "That's significant," Lorraine said. "Children that age were sometimes kept behind when families fled violence. Sometimes they were working off supposed debts. Sometimes they were essentially kidnapped and forced into servitude, and sometimes they were held as hostages to prevent families from seeking legal recourse." Marcus felt sick. "You're saying Sarah might have been kept deliberately?" "It's very possible. I've documented dozens of similar cases." White families who stole property from black families would often keep one child as a servant, claiming the child was payment for debts or voluntarily staying for work. In reality, these children had no choice, and their families had no power to get them back without risking further violence. Marcus thanked Lorraine and continued his research with this new understanding. He searched for any legal documents that might explain Sarah's presence in the Whitmore household. He found it in a probate record from April 1879, just 1 month after Joshua Carter's land had been seized. The document was labeled Indenture Agreement, and it made Marcus's hands shake with anger as he read it. The agreement stated that Sarah Carter, age 10, was being voluntarily indentured Pomart to Robert Whitmore for a period of 10 years to learn domestic skills and receive room, board, and Christian instruction. In exchange for her labor, Whitmore would provide clothing, food, and shelter. At the end of the 10-year period, when Sarah turned 20, she would be released from service with a payment of $50. The document was signed by Robert Whitmore and, allegedly, by Ruth Carter, Sarah's mother. But Marcus immediately recognized this as a fraudulent document. Ruth Carter had already fled to Chicago by April 1879, according to the census records. She couldn't have signed an indenture agreement in Mississippi. The signature was either forged or obtained under duress before the family fled. Marcus searched for more information about indenture agreements in post-Reconstruction Mississippi. What he discovered was that these arrangements were a common tactic used to continue enslaving black children after slavery had been abolished. Technically, the 13th Amendment had ended slavery in 1865, but it included an exception. Involuntary servitude was still legal as a punishment for crime. Southern states exploited this loophole through convict leasing, arresting black people on minor or fabricated charges, and forcing them to work without pay. But children couldn't be easily arrested and leased out, so white families used indenture agreements instead. These contracts claimed that black children were voluntarily working in white households in exchange for food, shelter, and training. In reality, the children had no choice, received minimal care, and were essentially enslaved under a different name. The practice was particularly common with children whose families had been killed, driven away, or otherwise separated. White families would claim that children had been abandoned and needed care, then force them into years of unpaid labor. Sarah Carter fit this pattern perfectly. Her father had likely been murdered. Her mother and siblings had fled to Chicago to escape violence. And Sarah had been kept behind, trapped in an indenture agreement that gave her no rights and no way to leave. Marcus found records showing that Robert Whitmore had filed the indenture agreement with the county courthouse in April 1879, making it legally binding under Mississippi law. Even if Ruth Carter had tried to challenge it from Chicago, she would have had no legal standing in Mississippi courts. And traveling back to Mississippi to fight for her daughter would have put her own life at risk. Sarah had been trapped, stolen just as surely as her father's land had been stolen. But the photograph from 1889 showed Sarah still living with the Whitmore family 10 years later. She should have been released from the indenture agreement by then, free to leave. So why was she still there? And why was she dressed in expensive clothing and included in family portraits? Marcus suspected there was more to this story, something that explained Sarah's continued presence and her unusual status within the household. He needed to find more records, more photographs, more evidence of what had really happened to Sarah Carter. Marcus contacted the Adams County Historical Society in Natchez, hoping they might have additional records or family histories that could shed light on Sarah's situation. The society's director, an elderly white woman named Eleanor Hayes, responded to his email within hours. Dr. Thompson, I'm very familiar with the Whitmore family. They were prominent in Natchez society for generations. I have several boxes of their papers and photographs that were donated to our archives in the 1970s when the last Whitmore descendant passed away. You're welcome to examine them if you come to Natchez. Marcus booked a flight for the following week. While he waited, he continued searching for any information about Sarah Carter's family in Chicago. He found Ruth Carter's death record from 1895. She had died at age 57, having worked as a laundress to support her 3 children. Her obituary in a black Chicago newspaper mentioned that she was survived by 3 children, but made no reference to a 4th child left behind in Mississippi. Had Ruth been forced to pretend Sarah didn't exist? Had she tried to get her daughter back and failed? Or had she believed Sarah was dead? When Marcus arrived in Natchez, Eleanor Hayes met him at the Historical Society, a gracious antebellum building that had once been a cotton merchant's mansion. She led him to a research room where she'd already pulled out several boxes of Whitmore family materials. I should warn you, Eleanor said, as she set the boxes on the table. The Whitmore family history is complicated. There are things that were never spoken about openly, but that everyone in Natchez society knew. I'll leave you to examine the materials, but if you have questions, I'll be in my office. Marcus opened the first box and found dozens of photographs spanning from the 1870s through the 1920s. He quickly located more images of Sarah, tracking her presence in the Whitmore household across nearly 2 decades. An 1890 photograph showed Sarah, now appearing about 11 or 12, standing with the Whitmore family at what looked like a holiday gathering. She was still dressed in fine clothing, still positioned slightly apart from the family, still holding that same carefully controlled expression. A photograph from 1893 showed Sarah as a teenager, perhaps 14 or 15. She stood on the porch of the Whitmore house, wearing a simple but well-made dress. Her expression had changed. The careful control was still there. But there was also something harder in her eyes, a resilience born from years of surviving an impossible situation. But it was a photograph from 1895 that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. The image showed Robert Whitmore's funeral. The family stood around his casket, Margaret Whitmore in widow's black, the two sons now grown men in their 20s. And standing with them, dressed in mourning clothes and positioned not as a servant but as a family member, was Sarah, now appearing to be about 16 years old. Marcus zoomed in on the image, studying every detail. Sarah's clothing was as expensive as Margaret Whitmore's. Her positioning in the photograph suggested she was mourning alongside the family, not attending them as a servant. And most tellingly, she was holding a document in her hands, a paper that appeared to be folded formally, like a legal document. Marcus's heart raced as he searched through the box for any papers that might explain what he was seeing. Near the bottom, he found a folder labeled Estate Documents, Robert Whitmore, 1895. Inside was Robert Whitmore's will, dated January 1895, just months before his death. Marcus read through the legal language carefully, his hands shaking as he reached the relevant section. To Sarah Carter, who has resided in my household since 1879, I bequeath the sum of $2,000 and grant her full ownership of the 200 acres of land known as the Carter property, which she is entitled to inherit as the sole surviving heir of Joshua Carter, whose property came into my possession in 1879. Marcus sat back, stunned. Robert Whitmore, on his deathbed, had acknowledged that Sarah was the rightful heir to the land he had stolen from her father. He had returned the property to her 16 years after taking it. But why? And what had happened in those 16 years that led to this extraordinary admission? Marcus spent the entire day examining the Whitmore family documents, trying to understand what had led Robert Whitmore to return the stolen land to Sarah. The papers revealed a complex and troubling story. In a box of personal correspondence, Marcus found letters between Robert Whitmore and his wife, Margaret, dating from 1879 to 1895. The early letters from 1879 and 1880 made casual references to the Carter girl and her duties in the household, washing dishes, cleaning rooms, helping with laundry. Sarah was clearly being treated as a servant, despite the expensive clothing she wore in photographs. But a letter from Margaret to Robert, dated 1882, revealed something significant. The girl is remarkably intelligent. She has been observing our sons' lessons with their tutor and has learned to read and do arithmetic simply from watching. I discovered her yesterday reading James's Latin primer. When I questioned her, she recited passages from memory. I do not know what to make of this, as we did not give her permission to educate herself, yet I cannot deny that she has done so. Marcus understood what was happening. Sarah, trapped in the Whitmore household, had been educating herself secretly, taking advantage of any opportunity to learn. This was an act of resistance and survival, building skills that might eventually allow her to escape or improve her situation. Another letter, from 1884, showed Margaret's growing conflict about Sarah's status in the household. The girl is 15 now and cannot continue as a mere servant. She speaks as well as our sons, reads better than I do, and has begun asking pointed questions about her father's property and the circumstances that brought her to our household. I fear she understands that an injustice was done to her family. Robert, we must consider what to do with her when her indenture expires next year. This was the key. Sarah hadn't been passive or helpless. As she grew older and more educated, she had begun questioning the situation, demanding answers, and refusing to accept the role she'd been assigned. Marcus found a journal that appeared to belong to Robert Whitmore himself, entries spanning from 1885 to 1895. The entries revealed a man grappling with guilt and fear as he aged and faced his own mortality. January 1885. Sarah's indenture expired today. By law, she's free to leave. But where would she go? Her family is in Chicago, and she has no money for passage. I have decided to offer her wages, $5 per month, to remain as a paid servant. This eases my conscience somewhat, though I know it does not address the greater wrong done to her father. But Sarah hadn't simply accepted wages and continued as a servant. Another entry from March 1885 revealed that she had confronted Whitmore directly. Sarah came to my study today with documents she had found, old property records and legal papers related to her father's land. She accused me of theft and murder, though she cannot prove the latter. She said, "You stole my inheritance and destroyed my family. The land belongs to me by right, and one day I will reclaim it." I was shaken by her boldness and her intelligence. She had pieced together the entire story from fragments of evidence she'd gathered over the years. Marcus was amazed. Sarah, at 16 years old, had conducted her own investigation into her father's stolen property. She had found evidence, confronted her father's killer, and demanded justice. Robert Whitmore's journal entries over the following decade showed his growing fear of Sarah's determination and his increasing awareness of his own mortality. June 1888. Sarah refuses to be treated as a servant any longer. She insists on being called Miss Carter, eats meals with the family rather than in the kitchen, and has demanded access to legal counsel regarding her inheritance. Margaret is mortified by the situation, but I find myself unable to deny Sarah's requests. There is something about her resolve that reminds me of Joshua Carter. The same dignity, the same refusal to be broken. November 1893. I am dying. The doctor says I have perhaps a year or two remaining. I find myself thinking constantly about Joshua Carter and what I took from him. Sarah has spent 14 years in my household, years that should have been hers to live freely. The land that should have been her inheritance has enriched my family while she served us. I must make this right before I die. January 1895. I have amended my will to return the Carter property to Sarah. It is hers by right of inheritance, and my conscience demands that I restore what was stolen. My sons are furious, arguing that the land is legally ours, but I know that legality and justice are not the same thing. Sarah deserves her father's legacy. Marcus sat back, processing what he discovered. Robert Whitmore had stolen Joshua Carter's land through fraudulent legal means and had essentially kidnapped Carter's daughter, forcing her into 10 years of unpaid labor. But Sarah had refused to be broken. She had educated herself, investigated her own history, confronted her oppressor, and ultimately forced him to acknowledge her rightful inheritance. This wasn't a simple story of victimization. It was a story of extraordinary resilience, intelligence, and determination. Sarah Carter had survived 16 years in the household of the man who had destroyed her family, and she had emerged with her dignity intact and her inheritance restored. But what happened to Sarah after Robert Whitmore's death? Did she successfully claim the land? Did she face opposition from the Whitmore family? Marcus needed to find out how Sarah's story ended. Marcus returned to the boxes of documents, searching for records from 1895 onward that would reveal what happened after Robert Whitmore's death. What he found showed that Sarah's battle for her inheritance was far from over. Robert Whitmore died in March 1895. His will was filed for probate in April, and immediately his two sons, James and Thomas Whitmore, contested the provisions, leaving property to Sarah. Marcus found the legal filing. Whitmore heirs ver. Sarah Carter, Adams County Chancery Court, May 1895. The brothers argued that their father had been mentally incompetent when he amended his will, that Sarah had unduly influenced him, and that, as a former indentured servant, she had no legal right to inherit property from her former master. The language of the legal challenge was vicious and racist, describing Sarah as a Negro woman of low character who manipulated an elderly man's guilty conscience for financial gain. Los Teus. The brothers demanded that the bequest to Sarah be nullated and the land remain with the Whitmore estate. But Sarah fought back. Marcus found her legal response, filed through an attorney named Benjamin Foster, one of the few black lawyers practicing in Mississippi in the 1890s. The response was detailed, powerful, and meticulously researched. Sarah's legal filing documented everything: her father's original purchase of the land in 1868, the fraudulent debt claims filed against him in 1878, the forced sale of the property in 1879, her own forced indenture, and her father's probable murder. She argued that Robert Whitmore's deathbed bequest was not generosity but restitution, a partial correction of a grave injustice. Most remarkably, Sarah had gathered evidence. She had found and preserved the original deed showing Joshua Carter's purchase of the land. She had located witnesses, elderly black residents of Adams County who remembered Joshua Carter and testified that the debt claims against him had been fabricated. She had even found a former clerk at the courthouse who admitted that the signatures on some of the legal documents from 1879 appeared to have been forged. The case went to trial in September 1895. Marcus found newspaper coverage of the proceedings in the Natchez Democrat. The articles were clearly biased against Sarah, describing her as an uppity Negro woman making outlandish claims against a respectable white family. But they also revealed that Sarah testified on her own behalf, presenting her evidence calmly and articulately despite hostile questioning from the Whitmore's attorney. One article quoted Sarah directly, "My father was murdered for the crime of being a successful black landowner. I was kept as a slave in all but name for 16 years. Mr. Robert Whitmore acknowledged these wrongs on his deathbed and tried to make them right. His sons now seek to perpetuate the injustice. I'm simply asking for what is mine by right, the land my father bought with his own money and built with his own hands." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Marcus found the court's decision, issued in October 1895, and his heart sank as he read it. The judge ruled in favor of the Whitmore brothers. He acknowledged that irregularities may have occurred in the transfer of Joshua Carter's property in 1879, but stated that too much time had passed to revisit those transactions. He further ruled that Robert Whitmore's bequest to Sarah, while generous in spirit, could not override the inheritance rights of his legitimate heirs. Sarah Carter lost her case. The land that should have been hers remained with the Whitmore family. Marcus felt a deep sense of injustice and anger reading the decision. Sarah had done everything right, gathered evidence, hired a lawyer, testified eloquently, and still the system had failed her because she was black and her opponents were white. But as he continued searching through the documents, he discovered that Sarah's story didn't end with the court decision. In a box of miscellaneous correspondence, he found a letter dated November 1895. written by Sarah Carter to her mother, Ruth, in Chicago. Dear Mother, I have lost the legal battle for Papa's land. The courts would not grant justice to our family. But I have not lost everything. I have gained something perhaps more valuable: education, resolve, and a clear understanding of how this unjust system operates. I am leaving Mississippi and coming to Chicago. I will find you, my brothers and my sister, and we will rebuild our family. The land is lost, but we remain. That is what matters most. Marcus knew he needed to trace Sarah's life after she left Mississippi in 1895. He contacted historians and archivists in Chicago, hoping to find records of Sarah's reunion with her family and what became of her in the following years. Dr. Patricia Washington, a historian at the Chicago History Museum specializing in black migration to the city, responded enthusiastically to Marcus's inquiry. The Carter family name appears in several records from Chicago's black community in the 1890s and early 1900s, Patricia explained over the phone. Ruth Carter was known in the community as a laundress who worked tirelessly to support her children. Her son Joshua Jr. became a postal worker, and her daughter Rebecca married and had children. I'll send you what I have, but you should know that Sarah Carter's story in Chicago is quite remarkable. The documents Patricia sent revealed that Sarah had arrived in Chicago in December 1895. At age 17, she had used the $2,000 cash bequest from Robert Whitmore's will, the only part of his bequest that the Whitmore brothers hadn't been able to contest, to pay for her travel and establish herself in the city. The reunion with her mother and siblings was documented in a letter Ruth Carter wrote to a friend, which had been preserved in a church archive. My daughter Sarah has returned to me after 16 years apart. I thought I would never see her again, having left her behind when we fled Mississippi. The pain of that separation has haunted me every day. Now she is here, and though she has suffered terribly, she is strong and determined to build a new life. The census records from 1900 showed Sarah living with her mother and working as a teacher at a small school for black children on Chicago's South Side. This was extraordinary. Sarah had managed to obtain enough education during her years in the Whitmore household to become a teacher, despite never attending formal school. Marcus found newspaper articles from Chicago's black press documenting Sarah's growing involvement in social activism. An article from the Chicago Defender in 1902 described a speech she gave at a church meeting. Miss Sarah Carter, late of Mississippi, addressed our congregation about the systematic theft of land from Negro families in the South. She spoke from personal experience, describing how her father's property was stolen through fraudulent legal means and how she spent 16 years fighting to reclaim her inheritance. She called upon the community to document and resist these injustices. Sarah had become an advocate, using her own story to expose the widespread practice of land theft that had destroyed thousands of black families' wealth during the post-Reconstruction period. Patricia sent Marcus another significant document, a pamphlet published in 1905 by the Chicago Urban League titled The Theft of Negro Property in the Post-War South. The pamphlet was co-authored by Sarah Carter and included detailed case studies of families who had lost land through violence, fraud, and legal manipulation. In the introduction, Sarah wrote, between 1865 and 1900, Negro families in the South acquired millions of acres of land through purchase, homesteading, and inheritance. But through systematic violence and legal theft, most of that land was taken by white families and corporations. My father's story is not unique. It is representative of thousands of similar stories. We must document these crimes and demand restitution. The pamphlet included Sarah's own detailed account of her father's land theft, her forced indenture, and her unsuccessful legal battle to reclaim her inheritance. She had transformed her personal trauma into a historical document that could educate others and support the growing movement for racial justice. Marcus found records showing that Sarah had married in 1908 to a man named William Morrison, a teacher and activist. They had 3 children together and both continued their advocacy work throughout their lives. But what particularly interested Marcus was a note Patricia had included with the documents. Sarah Carter Morrison maintained correspondence with several families in Adams County, Mississippi, throughout her life. She never gave up on the idea of reclaiming her father's land or seeking justice for his murder. In the 1920s and 1930s, she was involved in efforts to document land theft across the South and support legal challenges. You should look into the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Sarah was connected to that organization. Marcus realized that Sarah's story extended far beyond her personal experience. She had become part of a larger movement to document and challenge the systematic theft of black wealth in America. Following Patricia's lead, Marcus contacted the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALT, which had evolved from the organization Sarah had worked with in the early 20th century. The archives contained extensive materials related to Sarah Carter Morrison's decades-long effort to document land theft in the South. The archivist, an elderly man named James Crawford, greeted Marcus warmly. Sarah Morrison's work was groundbreaking, James explained as he pulled out boxes of materials. She spent over 30 years documenting cases of land theft from black families, and her research formed the foundation for some of the legal challenges that were attempted in the 1930s and 1940s. The first document Marcus examined was a bound volume titled Stolen Inheritance, Documentation of Property Theft from Negro Families in Mississippi, 1870-1920, compiled by Sarah Carter Morrison between 1910 and 1935. The volume contained over 200 detailed case studies, each documenting a black family's loss of property through fraud, violence, or legal manipulation. Sarah had traveled back to Mississippi multiple times during the 1910s and 1920s, always carefully, always with protection, but determined to gather evidence and testimonies. She had interviewed elderly black residents who remembered the Reconstruction era, collected property records, and documented patterns of theft that had stripped black families of generational wealth. Her father's case appeared as Case Number 47, with extensive documentation. Joshua Carter, Adams County, Mississippi. 200 acres stolen through fraudulent debt claims, 1879. Landowner likely murdered. Daughter Sarah held in forced servitude, 1879-1895. Land remains in possession of Whitmore family descendants as of 1935. But Sarah's work went far beyond documentation. Marcus found correspondence showing that she had worked with the NAACP and other civil rights organizations to support legal challenges to land theft. Several families had used Sarah's research to file lawsuits attempting to reclaim stolen property. Most of these cases failed. The legal system in the South remained hostile to black property claims, and too much time had passed for most claims to be viable under statutes of limitations. But Sarah persisted, believing that documentation itself had value even when immediate justice was impossible. In a letter dated 1932, Sarah wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois, "Our legal challenges have mostly failed, but the documentation we are creating will survive. Future generations will know that land was stolen from us, that wealth was extracted from our families, and that we fought back. This knowledge matters, even if we cannot recover what was taken." Marcus found evidence that Sarah had tried multiple times to reclaim her father's land, filing legal challenges in 1910, 1925, and 1938. Each time, the courts dismissed her claims, ruling that too much time had passed or that she lacked standing to challenge the property transfer. But in the late 1930s, something unexpected happened. Marcus found a letter, dated 1938, from an attorney named Robert Whitmore III, the grandson of the man who had stolen Joshua Carter's land. The letter began, "Dear Mrs. Morrison, I'm writing to you regarding the property in Adams County that once belonged to your father, Joshua Carter. I have recently learned the full truth of how my grandfather acquired this land, and I am deeply troubled by the injustice done to your family." Marcus's pulse quickened as he continued reading. Robert Whitmore III explained that he had discovered old family documents, including his grandfather's journal, which made clear that the land had been stolen through fraud. He wrote, "I cannot undo the wrong done to your father, nor can I restore the 16 years of your life that were taken. But I can acknowledge the truth and offer what restitution is possible. I'm prepared to transfer the property back to your family if you wish to reclaim it." This was extraordinary. A member of the family that had stolen Sarah's inheritance was voluntarily offering to return it, 60 years after the original theft. Marcus searched frantically through the documents, looking for Sarah's response and what happened next. He found it in a file labeled Carter Property Restoration, 1938-1940. Marcus carefully opened the file containing correspondence between Sarah and Robert Whitmore III. The exchange revealed a complex negotiation, not just over property, but over history, justice, and the possibility of restitution decades after a crime. Sarah's response to Whitmore's initial letter, dated September 1938, was measured but direct. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge the truth about how your family acquired my father's land. This acknowledgement alone is significant, as it is something the courts refuse to provide. However, before discussing any property transfer, I need to understand your motivations and what restitution you believe is possible after 60 years. The correspondence continued over several months. Robert Whitmore III explained that he had grown up hearing family stories about the Carter girl who had lived with his grandparents and had made trouble over an inheritance. But it wasn't until he discovered his grandfather's journal and other documents in the family estate that he understood the full scope of what had been done to Sarah and her family. Reading my grandfather's own words, his admission that he stole your father's land through fraudulent legal means, that your father was likely murdered, that you were kept in forced servitude, I felt a moral obligation to respond," Whitmore wrote. "I have benefited from wealth that should have belonged to your family. My children have been educated on profits from land that was stolen. This is not legally my responsibility, as the statute of limitations has long passed, but it is morally my responsibility." Sarah responded with a question that went to the heart of the matter. "Why now? Why after 60 years? Do you feel compelled to act when your father and uncles fought so hard to deny me this property in 1895? Whitmore's answer was honest. "Because I have children of my own now, and I cannot look them in the eye knowing that their inheritance is built on theft and violence. Because I have read enough history to understand that what happened to your family happened to thousands of black families, and this systematic theft of wealth has had consequences that persist to this day. And because you are still alive, And restitution, however late, is still possible. The correspondence revealed that Sarah struggled with the decision. In a letter to her daughter dated November 1938, she wrote, "I have spent 43 years fighting for justice for Papa's stolen land. Now, finally, someone from the Whitmore family is offering to return it. But I am 70 years old. What would I do with farmland in Mississippi? Your brothers and sister have built lives in Chicago. None of us are farmers, and none of us want to return to Mississippi, where Papa was murdered and I was enslaved." Sarah consulted with her family, with civil rights attorneys, and with other families whose land had been stolen. The consensus was that accepting the return of the property would be symbolically important, even if she never lived on it herself. But Sarah had a different idea, one that Marcus discovered in a letter she wrote to Robert Whitmore III in January 1939. "Mr. Whitmore, I have decided what I want to do with my father's land, if you are sincere in your offer to return it. I want the property to be transferred not to me personally, but to a trust that will use the land to benefit the black community of Adams County. The land could be sold and the proceeds used to establish a school, a community center, or a fund to support black students. This way, my father's stolen inheritance becomes an investment in the future, benefiting many families rather than just mine." Whitmore agreed to Sarah's proposal. The legal work took over a year, but in March 1940, the property was officially transferred from the Whitmore estate to a newly established trust called the Joshua Carter Memorial Fund. Marcus found the trust documents and news coverage of the transfer. The Natchez Democrat, which had so viciously opposed Sarah's legal claim in 1895, now ran a story with the headline, "Local Philanthropist Returns Historic Property to Negro Community." The article sanitized the history, describing it as a generous act of restitution, without fully acknowledging the violence and theft that had made restitution necessary. But the black press told the story more honestly. The Chicago Defender ran an article titled, "Daughter Reclaims Stolen Land After 60-Year Fight," which detailed Sarah's entire history and celebrated her decision to use the property for community benefit. The land was sold in 1941 for $8,000, far more than the $400 Robert Whitmore had paid for it in 1879, reflecting both inflation and the increased value of the property. The Joshua Carter Memorial Fund used the proceeds to establish a school for black children in Adams County, which operated until desegregation in the 1960s, when it was incorporated into the public school system. Marcus found photographs of the school, a modest wooden building with the name Joshua Carter Memorial School painted above the door. Hundreds of black children received education there, funded by the stolen land finally returned. Marcus stood in the Smithsonian's exhibition hall 6 months later, surrounded by the carefully curated display he had created, Stolen Inheritance, the Sarah Carter Story, and the Systematic Theft of Black Wealth in America. The exhibition opened with the 1889 photograph that had started his investigation, the young Sarah Carter standing with the Whitmore family, dressed in fine clothes but positioned as an outsider, her expression revealing the careful control of someone surviving an impossible situation. But now, visitors would understand the full story behind that image. The exhibition documented everything Marcus had discovered. Joshua Carter's success as a black landowner during Reconstruction, the fraudulent debt claims that stole his property, his probable murder, Sarah's forced indenture, her self-education and investigation, her failed legal battle in 1895, her advocacy work in Chicago, and finally the return of her father's land 60 years after it had been stolen. The exhibition also contextualized Sarah's story within the broader history of land theft from black families. Marcus had worked with economists and historians to document that between 1865 and 1920, black families had acquired approximately 15 million acres of land in the South, but by 1997, they retained only about 2 million acres. The rest had been stolen through violence, fraud, legal manipulation, and forced sales during Jim Crow. Sarah Carter's story is not unique, Marcus wrote in the exhibition's introduction. It is representative of thousands of similar stories, families who built wealth through hard work and sacrifice, only to have that wealth violently extracted by a system designed to maintain white supremacy. The theft of land from black families represents one of the largest transfers of wealth in American history, and its consequences persist today in the racial wealth gap. The exhibition drew enormous attention. Historians, activists, and descendants of families who had lost land came to see Sarah's story and recognize their own family histories in it. Among the visitors was an elderly woman named Grace Morrison Thomas, who approached Marcus on the second day of the exhibition with tears in her eyes. "I'm Sarah's great-granddaughter," Grace explained. "I grew up hearing stories about great-grandma Sarah and how she fought for her father's land, but I never knew the full story. My grandmother, Sarah's daughter, told me that Sarah never fully recovered from those 16 years in the Whitmore household, that she had nightmares about it until the day she died. But she also said Sarah was the strongest person she ever knew." Grace pulled out a photograph she'd brought with her, a picture of an elderly Sarah Carter Morrison, taken in the 1940s. She was standing in front of the Joshua Carter Memorial School in Mississippi, her hand resting on a plaque that read, "Built on land restored to the black community through the persistence and courage of Sarah Carter Morrison, daughter of Joshua Carter. Great-grandma went back to Mississippi one last time in 1942 to see the school that had been built with money from Papa Joshua's land, Grace explained. She said it was the first time in 63 years that she'd been back to Adams County without fear. She stood on her father's land, the land he'd bought with his own money and worked with his own hands, and she saw black children learning and growing there. She said that was better than owning the land herself. Marcus added this photograph to the exhibition, placing it at the end of the display as a conclusion to Sarah's long journey. The exhibition led to broader conversations about reparations and land restitution. Several families who had lost land under similar circumstances used Sarah's story as a template for their own investigations, searching archives for evidence of theft and filing legal claims where possible. The state of Mississippi issued a formal acknowledgement of the systematic theft of black-owned land during the Jim Crow era, though it stopped short of offering financial restitution. But the Joshua Carter Memorial Fund was expanded with new donations, providing scholarships for black students in Mississippi to study law, history, and social justice. Marcus was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and community gatherings about Sarah's story and the broader history of land theft. Each time, he emphasized the same themes: the importance of documentation, the persistence required to challenge injustice, and the reality that restitution, however late, matters. 1 year after the exhibition opened, Marcus returned to Natchez for a ceremony dedicating a historical marker at the site where Joshua Carter's original property had been located. The marker read, "This land was purchased in 1868 by Joshua Carter, a freedman who built a successful farm here during Reconstruction. In 1879, Carter's property was stolen through fraudulent legal means, and he was likely murdered. His daughter, Sarah Carter Morrison, 1878-1957, spent 60 years fighting to reclaim her father's legacy. The land was finally returned to the black community in 1940 and used to establish a school that educated hundreds of children. This marker honors Joshua Carter's achievement, Sarah's persistence, and all black families whose land and wealth were stolen during the Jim Crow era." At the dedication ceremony, Grace Morrison Thomas spoke about her great-grandmother's legacy. Sarah Carter Morrison lived to be 79 years old. She spent 16 years enslaved in the household of the man who stole her father's land, and she spent the next 60 years fighting for justice. She never got to see her father's land returned to her family during most of her lifetime, but she never gave up. She documented, she testified, she organized, she persisted. And in the end, she transformed stolen land into education and opportunity for hundreds of children. Grace paused, emotion thick in her voice. Great-grandma Sarah used to say, "Justice delayed is justice denied, but truth documented is truth preserved." She knew that even when the courts failed her, even when the law protected those who had stolen from her family, the truth mattered. By documenting what happened, by refusing to let the story be forgotten, she ensured that one day there would be some measure of accountability. Marcus stood before the memorial marker, thinking about the photograph that had started this entire journey. That image of 10-year-old Sarah standing with the Whitmore family in 1889. At first, it had seemed like a simple portrait of a black child in a white household, perhaps a servant or a ward, but it had been so much more than that. It was documentation of theft. It was evidence of forced servitude. It was proof that Sarah had survived in the household of her family's destroyers, and it was testimony to her resilience, the way she had maintained her dignity, educated herself, and prepared for the decades-long fight that lay ahead. That photograph, combined with all the other documents Marcus had uncovered, told a story that Americans needed to hear. That the racial wealth gap is not an accident of history, but the result of systematic violence and theft. That black families built substantial wealth during and after Reconstruction, only to have it violently extracted. And that the consequences of that theft persist generations later. But the story also revealed something else, that resistance persisted alongside oppression, that families documented their own histories even when official records erased them, and that justice, however delayed, was still worth pursuing. Sarah Carter Morrison had fought for 60 years to reclaim her father's stolen land. She had lived most of her life without seeing that restitution. But in the end, she had won, not just for herself, but for the hundreds of children who were educated because of her persistence, and for the historical record that would now forever acknowledge what had been done to her family and to thousands of families like hers. The 1889 photograph of Sarah would no longer seem innocent to those who saw it. It would be recognized for what it truly was: documentation of a crime, testimony of survival, and evidence that even in the most oppressive circumstances, people preserve their dignity, document the truth, and fight for justice across generations.